Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Welcome to the Tuesday edition. Feels like a Monday here on the fastest show in politics on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. After 6 weeks and 22 witnesses, here we are. The moment many have been waiting for. In Lower Manhattan, closing arguments are now underway in Donald Trump's criminal trial. Each of the 34, if you're playing along in your home game, felony falsification of business records charges that he is facing brings a sentence of up to 4 years in prison and a $5,000 fine. Of course, the president has pleaded not guilty and is still learning about the process here, which is amazing to me for someone who has been so heavily litigated over the course of his career. Donald Trump takes to Truth Social last night and writes, in all caps, "Why is the corrupt government allowed to make the final argument in the case against me? Why can't the defense go last? Big advantage, very unfair, witch hunt!" Exclamation point. That is the way it works here. Just ask Erik Larson. He does this for a living. Bloomberg legal reporter, has been in the courtroom for the duration of this trial, and I'm glad to say is with us now from World Headquarters in New York. Erik, that is the way it goes, right? If you are trying to carry the burden of proof, the prosecution, Donald Trump knows that?
Yes, I'm pretty sure that was it's just standard. But as we've seen, Mr. Trump has complained about a lot of things during the trial that are just sort of standard procedures or things that were sort of the result of his own defense team's doing. So it's a little bit of a distraction perhaps from what's really going on here, because actually after the prosecution gives its closing arguments, the jury is already going to have heard from several hours of the defense here. So it's not as though they're not getting an opportunity to say everything they want to say.
Fair enough, yes. Not a coin toss, though, to be clear. Erik, what are we going to witness here over the next day? We're hearing closing arguments might, in fact, go into tomorrow as we watch the summation of this case. What do you have your focus on?
Well, the judge said last week that he anticipated the closing statements or arguments would go all day today and potentially bleed into Wednesday. Although it's also possible that if they keep on track, they could wrap up today, especially because the judge has told the jury that they have the opportunity to stay later than 4:30 p.m. today if they wish. That's the usual closing time for the trial. And just to try to move things along, they do have to get their official instructions from the judge as well. So either way, I would imagine that deliberations would be going on for most of the day tomorrow.
You're one of the few Americans, Erik Larson, who has actually seen this jury, having been in the courtroom for the balance of the trial. Some are making the case that this could be a very quick turn here because they've been steeped in this case for so long, and for many it's cut and dry. But we've also had a lot of legal experts tell us to never try to predict a jury, that this is when the wild cards could come. What are the options? What are the outcomes potentially that you're looking for here? It's anyone's guess what is going on with this jury. Both sides are making their cases very strongly. Obviously, the government has the burden of proof here, and all that the defense needs is for one of those jurors to have reasonable doubt, and then you end up with a hung jury and a mistrial. So we're prepared for any of those outcomes. And as you noted, this is an unprecedented case, but we could get a verdict pretty quick. I mean, I've spoken with experts who say that if, for example, the jury is buying this case and they decide to convict, that could happen even within 1 day of deliberations. And if it goes on potentially longer than a few days, then perhaps the case is in a little bit more trouble. Yeah, fascinating to think where we would be at that point. CBS News is reporting, Erik, a New York corrections source says the Secret Service has met with local jail officials to talk about possible outcomes. Now, I will say that every analyst who's ever come on this show says, don't even dream of it. Donald Trump is not going to jail no matter what happens in this case. But the fact that they have to have this conversation, shorter sentences, I read, can be served at Rikers, which has two wings that are typically used for high-profile or infamous inmates. Is the Secret Service prepared to have officers in a jail cell if necessary?
I would imagine that is something they discussed quite some time ago, because you'll recall that Judge Merchan has threatened to jail Trump even before the trial was over for repeatedly violating a gag order barring Trump from publicly commenting about witnesses and the jury. So clearly there must have been some discussions going on a while ago, because the judge at any time could have ordered Trump to go to jail for that alone. Incredible. But I'm sure that is something that the Secret Service would have be obligated to be discussing.
Fascinating. It's really great to have you back, Erik. We've missed you because I know you've been locked in court. We can't always get our hands on Erik Larson, but today we have Bloomberg's legal reporter in New York. Great to see you, sir. Thank you for the update. This is going to happen this week. It's looking like it's coming here this week. And when the news breaks from the courthouse in Lower Manhattan, you will hear it first here on Bloomberg Radio. Be with us on the radio, on the satellite, or on YouTube, as I say, because this is going to be a big one. And we'll be offering you the best legal and political analysis that you're going to find anywhere on this program. As we turn to our other major story today, and that is the fallout from the Israeli airstrike on a tent camp in Rafah. The international condemnation has been heard loudly since Sunday, with witnesses describing a truly horrific scene and a lot of questions about how this could have happened. As we read on the terminal, trying to put this together here has been very difficult. As the IDF says, the attack was based on precise intelligence. That is a quote. And that it killed two senior officials from Hamas, which was, of course, the point of this here. French President Emmanuel Macron outraged the White House. Heartbreaking. The IDF investigating. Mick Mulroy is back with us on Bloomberg. I'm glad to say he's co-founder of the Lobo Institute, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, and is now personally involved in trying to deliver humanitarian aid to those who need it in Gaza. Mick, it's great to have you back. Your thoughts when you saw these images, 45 civilians killed. At what point do we reach Joe Biden's red line in Rafah?
So, Joe, of course, anytime civilians are killed in conflict, it is not a good thing. And I think what's really got people concerned here is the IDF has relocated civilians to try to avoid this, and then apparently struck in the area of which they were relocated to. It's unclear, I think, from the IDF's statement that the actual casualties were caused by the munitions that they used to kill the two Hamas militants, or as their statement indicates, it might have been collateral and then a secondary explosion that caused the fire. I don't know, but obviously a lot of concern, considering the whole point was to move them to a location that was out of harm's way, and then there was a strike in the vicinity.
I'm glad you mentioned that. The IDF says it cannot explain the fires that followed the strikes that they, again, claim were precise. Is it on the IDF? Is it on the Israeli military to know the difference? If there's, say, a depot of some sort next to a target, you're still putting civilians at risk.
That's right. When it comes to these type of assessments, you have to have a military necessity. If they were correct and they were going after Hamas leadership, that is a military necessity and a valid military target. But then there's proportionality, right? So that's where I think the U.S. government has had issues with the IDF, is the proportionality. If you use a large diameter bomb in an urban area, for example, you'll likely kill the two militants, but you also might flatten the buildings that are around it, killing civilians. That, of course, would be out of proportion. So I don't know the details here and whether they did an accurate assessment of the potential collateral facilities like a ammunition depot or fuel depot or something that could have caused this fire. Yeah. But that is all something that's taken into account when they look at whether there was proportionality in their decision to take the strike.
Well, Joe Biden's red line was in reference to an invasion of Rafah many weeks ago when he said that. And we've seen this very sort of incremental approach here. Some would say limited approach. But after this story that we're talking about, 45 dead, clearly airstrikes that are taking place. We also read Israeli tanks have reached the center of Rafah, a sign that they could be nearing the goal of taking full control of the city. So if not now, when is the full invasion of Rafah? Aren't we seeing it?
Well, we very well could be. So tanks are used in urban combat, and there is an armored division as well as a airborne division that was arrayed to be able to do this offensive. A tank indicates to me, quite frankly, that they're going with the full option. A limited would be more special operations, reconnaissance driven. But when you have tanks inside cities, that indicates that it's a full invasion. And that is exactly what the Biden administration did not want to see. So it looks like that's the case. Of course, we have to see more information on how this fully plays out.
I'd like to ask you your thoughts on the temporary pier. As I see images of the pier apparently having trouble staying afloat. This was put in place to the tune of many millions of dollars and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears by the United States military to deliver aid to Gaza, trying to get around some of the more obvious crossings that have been blocked. It hasn't been delivering nearly the aid that was expected. And I see Donald Trump's campaign manager tweeting a picture of this bridge starting to sink, calling it the Biden Pier to Nowhere. As this takes on political connotations, Mick, was this flawed in its concept to begin with?
So first of all, I got to point out just the Herculean effort that the U.S. military, Central Command, and particularly the Army component of that is who is responsible for this system, this JLOT system. It is essential if it can be utilized by the humanitarian community. So the issue right now is to bring in a lot of aid to Cyprus and get the barges running to the JLOTs. It is significantly challenged in the weather conditions, and the servicemen and women that are responsible for it are doing everything they can to keep it up and running. But I do think if it is up and running and aid starts flowing, it is absolutely essential, because aid is not coming in through, say, the Rafah crossing right now, which is right in the middle of this offensive in Rafah, and it's not coming in anywhere near the quantities needed for the civilian population in Gaza. So it's certainly not perfect, and nothing in a conflict, or especially a maritime conflict environment, is. But I do think it is essential, and the more aid that starts flowing over, I think it'll show its value, especially to the people who are on the verge of a famine in northern Gaza.
Well, Mick, I know that you are among a group of specialized people who are trying to come up with alternative solutions here, and there's probably a lot that you can't talk about right now. But how do you see this playing out? We've tried airdrops. We built an entire pier here that may not be working. We're dealing with border crossings that are closed when trucks showed up. And, of course, Hamas willing to attack aid trucks and steal food when they do get through. What other option do we have?
Right, Joe. I really do think that the argument or the answer is not one or the other. It is all the above. There's about 7 ground crossings into Gaza. It would be good if all of those were open. There's political issues in Israel. There's families of the hostages that block these. But they also need a maritime option. I mean, it's a 25-mile long territory that has a 25-mile long coastline. They would want to have a maritime option, and that can bring in aid at scale. Airdrops, although they can be used for specific cases, simply can't bring enough to make that much of an effort or that much of a difference. I do think the ground and maritime taken together can not only decompress the situation when it comes to famine, but potentially help in the rebuilding of Gaza for when this ceasefire eventually does happen and the end of hostilities happens. That has to happen, because right now 85% of the dwellings in Gaza are uninhabitable. So this is something that I think is needed for the near and long term.
Israeli Defense Forces say 2 militants, as I mentioned, were killed in this attack in Rafah. How many are left? What is left of Hamas in Rafah? Do we have an understanding?
It's difficult, Joe, to get a handle on that. The IDF said they have essentially dismantled or significantly degraded 20 of the 24 battalions, if you will, with the 4 remaining being in Rafah, which is why they believed they needed militarily to have this objective. It's unclear of how many were killed. I've seen estimates between 10 and 15,000. It was estimated to be around 30,000. But it's also critical for the IDF perspective to destroy the tunnel systems, which is very significant. And of course, the advanced munitions, the rockets and such that they can use to really threaten Israel. And so I think there's a multi-pronged objective here when it comes to the military. They will not end Hamas. Yeah. The philosophy, obviously, a terrorist organization is it potentially could even increase in size, but they need to destroy the tunnels. They need to capture or kill the leadership, and they need to significantly destroy the munitions they can use to threaten Israel.
Well, Mick, when you start to get aid flowing, we'd love to talk to you about how you figured this out in this ongoing effort. Mick Mulroy, co-founder of the Lobo Institute, thank you for helping us get started here on the fastest show in politics. From Washington to New York and to Israel, this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
As we ponder the question, after what we saw over the weekend, was it campaign malpractice to send the former president of the United States into a room full of libertarians, only to be booed and heckled publicly at length on Saturday? Did you see this? This is at the Washington Hilton. Over the weekend, the Libertarian Convention. Enter Donald Trump. Let's watch.
And its national convention on Saturday, the Libertarian Party should nominate Trump for President of the United States. Whoa. That's nice.
There you go. I spared you a good chunk of that. This went on forever. The heckling, extended booing to the point where Trump's asking, what the hell do you guys run for anyway if you want just 3%? I don't know what he was doing there. He was followed by RFK Jr., who had a very deliberate message for libertarians who love him. Let's assemble our panel. Jeanne Sheehan Zaino is with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor, of course, Democratic analyst and now senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. She's joined by Lisa Camooso Miller, Republican strategist, former communications director at the Republican National Committee, and host of the Friday Reporter podcast. Jeanne and Lisa, welcome. Lisa, I'll start with you. I know you're not running the Donald Trump campaign, but they did that on purpose. What did they get for it?
You know, Joe, I think, I mean, it's hard to really sort of get into the mind of what and why, but he still has to appeal to some of those that are in the room in that space, right? And so that room really represents sort of the Republican, yes, of course, libertarian, but those of us that sort of live in a the former Republican Party, right? So there's a lot of my colleagues and friends that I work with that live there today. And so if you're on the campaign, you're seeing that as an opportunity perhaps to appeal to some of those who are hardened against you and perhaps going to sit it out or even pull the lever for the Democratic candidate. But that's a tough crowd. And it's really, unfortunately, Joe, it's inside the Beltway. And it's an organization that probably wasn't going to support Trump anyway. So I'm not sure it's going to have very much impact. But certainly it must have hurt the ego of the former president, if nothing else. Yeah.
Why put him through it? Because, you know, Lisa's right, Jeanne. Does anyone in the world know that the Libertarian Convention's taking place? Well, now they do. When they look at their Twitter scroll and they see Donald Trump being disrespected for quite a length of time at the podium. What was the strategy here?
Well, this is the third biggest political party in the country. They're on 37, 38 ballots. So it's a big get. You know, when you talk about where the campaign misstepped, I would suggest if you put your candidate in there and ask them to nominate you, you should have done the paperwork to get that nomination. And of course, the next day we find out that, oh, by the way, despite asking, the campaign just didn't do the paperwork. And he winds up with like 2 write-in ballot votes or something, you know, just slightly worse than RFK Jr. So, you know, it was a bad step by the campaign. I do think his overall instinct, or the campaign's instinct, to go and try to spread this map is a good instinct. In this case, it seemed to have backfired. And I just loved him gaslighting them right back. When they booed and heckled, he said, oh, you want to just repeat your 3% you get every 4 years?
Right.
And he basically pounced off the stage in 30 minutes where he'll usually go 90. So I enjoyed it. I was glad we went. So.
Well, good. We know what Jeannie was watching on Saturday night on a Memorial Day weekend, but RFK Jr. showed up as well. He was there the next night and says, this is interesting. I want to hear from both of you on this potential wrinkle or pocket of real weakness for Donald Trump. To Lisa's point, these are in many cases conservatives in that room. RFK Jr. says Trump presided over the greatest restriction of individual liberties this country has ever known. This is why they were yelling at him, saying you took our freedoms away. Quote, he did not stand up for the Constitution when it really mattered, pointing to COVID. Now, here's the line of the weekend. Maybe a brainworm ate that part of my memory, RFK said. But I don't recall any part of the Constitution that creates an exemption for pandemics. Is this a problem for Donald Trump? Or is he such an extreme alternative to Joe Biden in a general election, Lisa, that COVID does not come up?
Joe, he lost me at earworm or brainworm or whatever that is that he talks about.
Take your pick.
I don't necessarily think that I think he's a spoiler. And I think that he probably takes votes away from Joe Biden for those who aren't for Trump, but don't necessarily feel good about the way the White House has been leading on the economy and foreign affairs issues. So that alone, I think, just represents a threat that's not a Donald Trump threat as much as it's a threat to the sitting president, in my opinion.
Well, that's a great point, Jeannie. Your thought on that? It's not like Joe Biden can criticize Donald Trump about COVID restrictions.
No, nor would he want to. And, I think the fact that we see, Donald Trump and his campaign going after RFK shows that they feel, and of course the evidence is sort of all over the map on this, that they may be the losers. And, we can't forget that in an election that is, at least the polls tell us, as tight as this is, a few thousand votes matter. And so, just ask George Bush in 1992, or just ask Hillary Clinton in 2016, or Al Gore in 2000. They all feel that their election was taken from them by a few thousand votes from a third party candidate with no hope of winning. So, Donald Trump has that fear. I think Joe Biden, to a certain extent, although they're feeling a little better on that point. So this is a challenge with RFK in there if he's able to get these votes. And, the fact that, the one thing that Donald Trump did, not the only thing, but one important thing he did, was pushing so hard to get us to get some kind of vaccination from COVID. And he did it, and he has run away from it throughout this election for the very reason you were just talking about. It's absolutely maddening. I don't see how that brings back the voters Lisa was talking about, the Republicans who are Republicans of the past, if you will. They too got the vaccine, thankfully, that he put into practice. So, I'm not sure how this helps Donald Trump or, quite frankly, RFK Jr., but it's a big deal in this Libertarian Party.
Well, it worked better than the bleach. We'll say that, Lisa. I don't know to what extent Joe Biden's going to be answering questions about his response to COVID here. But if you ask him, it's a point of pride, right? This is not something that's going to be driving voters. It's going to be inflation. It's going to be the border. It's going to be abortion and so many of the other social issues that we're talking about here. It's also going to be foreign policy. And I'm struck by this tweet that we saw from Donald Trump's campaign manager. I mentioned it once earlier this hour. Chris LaCivita tweets a picture of the temporary pier in Gaza, which is half underwater in this photograph. Quote, the Biden pier to nowhere, unquote. Symbolic of a campaign that we're reading about this morning, Jeannie. Democrats are having nightmares. All of a sudden, there's this realization that, hey, we're in trouble. To what extent, Lisa, is Chris LaCivita's tweet appropriate at this stage of the campaign? Or maybe I should say accurate?
We're like in the silly season, right? Always, all the time, Joe. But I think it's indicative of how the papers, the stories, everything today is reading is that this is going to continue to be this conflict that's happening in the Middle East is going to continue to be the biggest challenge for Joe Biden between now and November. And it overshadows every other thing. It overshadows any successes he has in the economy, in the beatback for inflation, just about everything, because this continues to hang over his head. As someone who, by the way, was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, right, when he was in the Senate, he's someone who really sees this as his legacy. And the fact that he warned Benjamin Netanyahu about going into Rafah, the fact that he and the UN and everyone else has warned that this not happen. While I think it's probably off color for Lasavita to be saying that in the morning after terrible losses in Gaza, I also think, too, that he probably sees this as the biggest challenge for the Biden campaign.
What do you think about this, Jeannie? I want to give you a chance to reply, because the story in Israel is getting worse now that we're talking about a very difficult weekend here in Israel, and a solution in the form of this pier that does not appear to be working. I realize that this could change, but we've got tanks, Israeli tanks in the center of Rafah, and Joe Biden talking about red lines that don't seem to exist.
You know, I think, Chris Lasavito, it's absolutely shameful. And I agree with Lisa. The morning after, or hours, if you will, after, we see 45 innocent people killed, babies. The pictures coming out of there are absolutely horrific. And you send over a picture of a bridge that our government and our military folks on Memorial Day weekend, by the way, they have put in hours of blood, sweat, and tears to get that up and running. And it may not be at the point where we all want it to be at this point, but the goal is admirable. The work has been hard, and it has been for something I would think all Americans, regardless of your political party or candidate of choice in the 24 election, would be supportive of, which is getting aid into civilian populations that desperately need it. To, make fun of that bridge to nowhere, blah, blah, blah. It's shameful. Joe Biden, as president of the United States, doesn't have the luxury of sitting back like Donald Trump does as a former president not in office. He's got to make decisions. He drew a red line that's going to come back to be something he's going to have to address. And we will see where he goes with that once we have more information on what happened. But I thought the tweet or whatever Lasavita sent out was shameful. This is the work of our military. This is the work of our government. And you would think they would be patriotic enough on Memorial Day to support that.
Well, I'll tell you what, Donald Trump's Memorial Day tweet, or truth, I guess it was, Lisa, would make you wonder about his thoughts on the holiday. He did not mention Americans who served the country or who have died for the country. He wrote a message to the quote unquote scumbags who have opposed him politically and legally. Is the nation ready for 4 more of that?
I don't know, Joe. I mean, look, I'm a kid of a family that has served, right? And they considered, from now until the end of time, will consider the former president a draft dodger. They do not have a lot of respect for him and the way he treats or talks about our armed services. They do not like the fact that he says what he says. This is the head of all armed services. This is the top of the top. And this is the way he talks about those who go into these places and keep us safe here at home. Are we ready for it? No, Joe, we are definitely not. Does it look like we're headed that way? It absolutely does.
Yeah. Well, I guess to an extent it's been normalized. Just to be clear, I said scumbag. It's, quote, "Happy Memorial Day to all, including the human scum that is working so hard to destroy our once great country, and to the radical left, Trump-hating federal judge in New York that presided over." I could go on, but there's not enough time or enough caps. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. Glad you're with us.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Bringing our attention to Lower Manhattan, of course, That is the criminal trial of Donald Trump today. Closing arguments are now officially underway, and this could be a pivotal week here in the trial. It is expected that this case will go to the jury likely Wednesday or Thursday, and then, of course, it's off to deliberations, and we'll see what happens with that. Many are predicting a short turn in deliberations here. We'll see what Robert McWhirter thinks, a reliable voice for us in understanding each phase of this trial. He's back with us now, criminal and constitutional law attorney. Robert, the idea is here, and we heard it from the judge, closing arguments may well last into tomorrow. After the last many weeks, why take so long to sum up the case?
I think that the defense is just looking for things to say. I don't know why it would take so long. It is somewhat of a complicated case, but, the prosecution can lay out exactly what went on here. You don't have to go into a great, big, huge dissertation on things. And I'm not sure how much the defense is going to say. They're going to meticulously try to attack everybody, spend a lot of time on Michael Cohen, a lot of time on Ms. Daniels, but I don't know that they're going to get to the essential issue. One thing that the defense has never adequately explained here is, nor do they deny, is that there was a $130,000 payment made to Ms. Daniels. They don't really have an explanation. They say, well, Donald Trump didn't sleep with her, and somehow she was extorting him. But then are they really saying that Donald Trump is the kind of man who would pay off an extortionist? I don't think so. They don't have a good explanation. And I think that the argument that maybe Michael Cohen did this out of the goodness of his heart to help Stormy Daniels just doesn't go anywhere.
Donald Trump seems to be learning a little bit more about the process today, Robert. Maybe if he'd hired you, he would have known the way this works with closing arguments. Quote, this is a post on social media. Why is the corrupt government allowed to make the final argument in the case against me? Why can't the defense go last? He writes, big advantage, very unfair, witch hunt, exclamation point. Robert, this is the way it works. It's supposed to work this way, correct? Yes. When you carry the burden of proof.
The government has the burden of proof. That's why the law gives them the last shot. There's a rare situation if the government was to come up with something totally new in their last shot, you can get what's called rebuttal, but it's very, very, very rare. And the government would have to really do something. And I don't see the state prosecutors doing this. The state prosecutors have kind of given us a master class in how to structure good prosecution. It's structured well. Their cross-examinations were excellent. Their presentations of the witnesses were appropriately sequenced and timed. So I don't see them making any kind of blunder like that. And Mr. Trump can, if you notice, Mr. Trump spends a lot of time complaining about procedures because he doesn't really want to talk about the facts.
Well, we will note that he has pleaded not guilty in this case. But after 6 weeks and 22 witnesses, Robert, what is this jury about to go through? And why does everyone seem to think that this will be a brief deliberation?
Because what the jury is going to do is, of course, they're going to be going into a room. I would guess that if closing arguments end today, which they could, the case will be over before Friday. If closing arguments don't end until Thursday, then it might extend it through the weekend and they'll come back. My prediction is this case will be over before Friday. And they're going to have to deliberate. I think that the deliberation will be somewhat short because the quality of the defense is not very high. I think Mr. Trump had some good lawyers, but he was calling the shots here. And I think Mr. Trump is far more interested in what's going on outside of the courtroom than he is what's going on inside of the courtroom. Everything is designed for his political messaging. And look, I'll give you one example. He complains that he can't, has to be in this trial and he can't go out and campaign. Well, if he goes out to campaign in the Bronx, he talked to maybe 8,000 people at that rally. His staff claimed it was 25,000, but the police, now it was only 8,000. Well, okay, so he can't go do that. But you do realize that every day after trial, he gets to go talk to many million because he gets free media time when he makes a statement after every day's course of proceedings. That's free media coverage that reaches millions versus a rally that might reach a few thousand. So he's really designed this to his favors, and he's prepared everybody for his argument after he loses. He's not running around saying this is a great, fair jury. In fact, if they end up acquitting, he's going to be in a kind of a strange situation of turning around and say, well, I guess everything really was fair. So I just don't think that the defense has much quality here in terms of what they're saying. They can't explain certain key issues, like why did Stormy Daniels get paid $130,000?
Well, it sounds like you're bracing for a conviction on at least some of these 34 charges here. CBS News is reporting that the Secret Service has in fact met with New York corrections officials to discuss the possibility of incarceration. Robert, I don't know if that's something that you're allowing for, if there's a couple of days in a room somewhere, but obviously Donald Trump wouldn't be alone in that room. He would require Secret Service protection no matter where he went. Does this sound like a formality to you or a potential reality?
Oh, I think these are smart agents who figure out they have to plan for every contingency. It is a very real possibility that Donald Trump will get convicted. And so they have to plan for that eventuality. A defendant immediately would go into the custody. Well, let's be clear. If he receives jail time on this, he will go into custody of the New York Department of Corrections. When that happens is a little open. It probably wouldn't happen right after conviction, but there is a possibility of that. The judge could decide to do that. In all likelihood, you're going to have about a month or so before a sentencing hearing. And then Donald Trump will request that he be allowed to be released pending his appeal. So it's going to be several months before that eventuality would happen. And he actually would be put in jail. And the judge, for a first-time offense, may decide not to give him jail time. However, given Mr. Trump's behavior, if Mr. Trump wasn't Mr. Trump, he would most assuredly be looking at jail time for his behavior and the way he's conducted himself during the trial.
Well, it is interesting that he apparently violated the gag order a couple of times since the weekend, but we're beyond gag orders at this point with this trial about to resolve. I've got less than a minute here, Robert. Does the impact of celebrity move this jury, or are we beyond that when it's a former president?
Well, we don't know. We don't know how this affects the jury. In high celebrity cases, I think defendants get an extra kind of benefit. I mean, just look at O.J. Simpson's case, for instance. He gets a greater benefit. If there is a rabid Trump supporter on this jury, they could gum up the entire thing. If there's one or two, that means there could be a hung jury. Now, if a juror decides not to deliberate at all, the other jurors can tell the judge, and that juror can be replaced. But if it's somebody who just is going to gum the whole thing up, well, then you could have a mistrial here, and this trial could be rescheduled to be tried again.
Well, you're the first person we'll call. Robert McWhirter, criminal constitutional law attorney. Thank you, Robert, for being with us. I suspect we may be talking again this week. I hope that is the case.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
And some interesting storylines coming out of the weekend here. Very few of them good for Joe Biden. Even as we talk this day about closing arguments in the criminal trial of Donald Trump, the headlines from Israel are very problematic for a president who is already watching progressive Democrats reconsider their support based on Israel policy. When you consider the polling now, the approval numbers, some of the polls we saw on Friday from the Cook Political Report from Emerson painting a picture that is very consistent with Bloomberg polling that shows the president potentially losing this race, at least in the swing states. So everyone wakes up to Politico this morning and the playbook. Full-blown freakout is the headline. And we thought, boy, Cliff Young might have something to say about that because he's actually doing his own research at Ipsos and a great voice on the campaign for us here at Bloomberg. He's with us at the table now. How are things? You had a long weekend. The lawmakers are gone. You can park where you want in Washington.
Yeah,
what else?
It's a great day.
It is a great day. Thank you for coming in. You're attempting to answer this great question that is kind of a flip to, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? You're asking, What is the greatest problem facing America? And I guess we shouldn't be too surprised by what you found, because we talk about it here on Bloomberg every day.
Yeah, it's the economy. And more specifically, it's inflation. Mm-hmm. And more problematic for the Biden camp is that their core constituencies, younger Americans, Hispanic Americans, Black Americans, less affluent Americans, all are affected by inflation. Mm-hmm. Now, it's not rates. People don't understand rates, inflation rates. It's about price levels and the ability to make ends meet. And there's a lingering effect of this, and this is problematic for the Biden campaign.
Although a young prospective homeowner might be able to talk to you about rates, or somebody who owes money on a car, right? There are ways in which interest rates are biting us in a literal way. But you go back to Joe Biden a couple of weeks ago predicting that interest rate cut, and boy, was he projecting, wasn't he?
Yeah, he really wanted things to be better. They know their problem, right? But once again, if you were paying 2 years ago $150 for basic foodstuffs, and today you're paying $170, that's $20 more that you're paying, and that's $20 more that you don't have. Right. And I think that there's been a lot of tone deafness among the Democrats, among elites, understanding how the average person, the average American, goes about their day-to-day. And their day-to-day is counting nickels and dimes.
That's right. And it's not just the trajectory of inflation. It's where prices are now versus where they were then, right? We talk about slowing inflation as if this is a great thing, but it just means that prices are going up still, but at a slower rate.
Slower.
Yeah.
But they're still high.
That's not a win.
Yeah, that's not a win. That's not a win. And the experience is that you need time. You need wages to increase at the same rate, if not at a greater rate. And it's not about the overall average. We're not talking about the United States. We're talking about individuals in these key demographics as well as in the key swing states.
So that's number one, and that did not surprise us. Number two did surprise me, and I'd love your thoughts on this. By the way, the economy at 23%, most important problem facing America. Number two was political extremism. And if you're with us on Bloomberg TV, you can see it was right behind the economy at 21%. This is something shared by both sides.
Yeah, so on the Democratic side, it's threats to democracy. And who's the threat? Donald Trump. It's a way to mobilize the anti-Trump vote. And on the other side, what are issues of political extremism and problems with the democracy? It's a broken system. And who's going to fix the broken system? Donald Trump. And so in my mind, looking forward, if the economy continues to improve, we should see that as threats to democracy and political extremism becoming the number one issue. But today, that's not the case. Today, it still is the economy and inflation. And I would say it's Biden's Achilles heel.
You surprised to see immigration at 13%? In some polling during the early states, it was the number one issue for primary voters.
Yeah, it's a critical issue. It's a critical issue on the borders. It's a critical issue among Republicans. It's what Trump won on in 2016. And if you have a black swan event, some sort of mad rush at the border, something that's really, really symbolic and apparent, it could swing things as well. It is a Republican issue. It is a Trump issue.
The issue of Israel is something that's been dogging Joe Biden. And I always hear that voters don't make decisions based on geopolitics. But this one has been resonating on a domestic level in a very real way. He's certainly worried about it. The campaign has been directing resources in a way that makes that clear, specifically in Michigan. But across the country, when it comes to progressives, this strike in Rafah over the weekend, 45 more civilians killed, is bad news for the White House and for the campaign. How is the issue playing on the trail?
He needs it to go away. And so it doesn't help him on the margins. We saw the primary votes in Michigan. That's problematic for Biden and for the Democrats. But when push comes to shove, it's inflation over the war in Gaza across all demographic groups. So yes, it's an issue, but it's an issue specifically in specific places. The real issue, once again, is still inflation and the inability of certain Americans in certain constituency groups to make ends meet.
We're spending time with Cliff Young from Ipsos and his great polling and research that helps us find some interesting trends here on the campaign trail. Talk to me about approval ratings. You can give us a little seminar on this with Joe Biden at about 40%. History tells us what, Cliff?
Yeah, so we have a database at Ipsos of hundreds of elections around the world. We call this our salad bowl approach. We just kind of throw everything together and mix it up a bit. But what does it tell us? It tells us basically that a sitting president at 40% approval rating has better than a 50-50 chance of winning the next election. To be very specific, it's 55% chance of winning the next election. So we've been tracking over time and seeing where Biden's approval ratings are, and they're right at that tipping point. Depending on how you put it together, how you count it, if you take the average of all the polls out there, it's about at 39.5.
Sure, okay.
It's not a good place to be at this point
It's
for
underwater,
Biden.
technically. Though, relatively speaking, he's seen way worse.
Yeah, well, his head's like poking out of the water. He's keeping up above it, then he's falling below.
What's it looked like in the curve over the course of this term?
He has been it's been basically a fluctuation around a mean, which is an average, which is like that hasn't moved at all. He's been a little bit below, a little bit above, a little bit below, a little bit above, and that's where he's been. I had the expectation that he would have improved by now, and that is not the case. So he's in a difficult place when it comes to that metric.
Getting back to the big freak out headline at Politico this morning, is it time to freak out? We're told frequently people don't pay attention to Labor Day. He's got a lot of money. He doesn't seem to have a donor problem, although he did on a monthly basis fall behind Donald Trump for the first time in this cycle last month. When you look at the next 6, how much bandwidth does this campaign have to turn it around?
Well, the campaign hasn't started. And so
hasn't started.
It really hasn't started. I mean, the heavy lifting happens
you laugh
after.
when people say it's too late.
Well, I think it's a little premature.
Yeah.
I think what we're coming to the market in general, when I say is coming to terms with, is that Donald Trump has a significant non-zero chance of winning. We know that now. When it comes to the Biden camp, he has a lot of he has a lot of weaknesses. That one would expect that with an improving economy that he'd be able to work out, but the campaign hasn't started. He hasn't taken his case in a coherent way to the people, to his constituency groups, and we will see what happens once that happens.
Does it start with the first debate? Is that when people tune in?
Well, I think it's very telling that we're having a first debate when we
in
are.
June? Yeah.
Yeah, obviously the Biden camp is
so
worried.
Maybe not so much.
They think they have to make a statement.
Yeah.
And I think if not freaking out, they are feeling the pressure and believe they have to have a concrete proof point showing that he is in the game.
Well, we're having a watch party that night. You should come by.
Okay.
Great to see Cliff Young always at the desk here at Bloomberg with us from Ipsos Polling. We always learn something when we talk to Cliff. He's the president of U.S. Public Affairs at Ipsos, and great to have you with us, sir, on Balance of Power. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.